This is the Innovators Everywhere Pathways to Progress Through Unlikely Problem Solvers panel. There are 5 of us, and one of our panelists, Eriko, is also here, and so she will also introduce herself. But thank you for joining and for being part of this. From my background, and I'll give a little bit of my introduction. I'm the manager of storytelling and engagement at the organization Second Muse, and also have a side project called 180 Degrees of Impact, where for fun I just interview people who are making the world a better place. And so I feel very comfortable being with this awesome group of people, and they'll all introduce themselves. But I'm so glad so many of you showed up. I'm surprised that the room is almost completely full right now. And I'm hoping we'll really have time to hear from all of you as we go throughout this panel. And so without further ado, I'm hoping all of our panelists could kind of start out, all of you, could start out by introducing yourselves and really why the theme of this panel, collaboration with unlikely problem solvers, is important to you. And so I figured maybe we could start over here with you, Eriko, if you want to tell everyone who you are.
All right. Can you guys hear me? Yep. Okay. Hi, this is Eriko Nishomoto. I am socially minded entrepreneur. So I have the NPO called Innovators in Boston, here in Boston, and then doing the multicultural community-based open innovation activities, such as NASA Hackathon, which is probably we can mention later, but one of the largest hackathon in the world run by NASA. So I've been organizing the Innovators since 2014, and last year was the 5th year we've been organizing here. And then, so what I'm special about is in hackathon we always have a team called international team, which invites Japanese people to join to Isaac Boston remotely. So it's a kind of special activity what we're doing to emphasize global collaboration. And also for myself, I was here. I studied Babson MBA, graduated 2014, and at the time I established as Innovative. But before that, I also established the technology consulting company, and doing the helping M&A for Japanese company, for example, tech due diligence or like a PMI activity after the acquisition. And also before that, I used to work in a large company in global firm like Apple or Sumitomo, which is Japanese trading company, to helping doing automation of supply chain or something like that.
Good afternoon. I was about to say good morning. So, lack of coffee there. My name is Clarence Edwards, and up until Thursday, I was the senior advisor for international development policy for the Australian embassy here down in Washington, D.C. But I left, and I'm also a fellow at something called a Social Impact Fellow for Moving Worlds Institute, which is out in Seattle, which helps mid-career professionals seeking to have a greater social impact. My background, I spent 6 years with the Australian government, helping to build relationships for the aid program in the U.S. with private sector companies, entrepreneurs, and the U.S. government and other donors. Before that, I was a lobbyist for a few years representing the One campaign, and so I was a bond-nosed Democratic lobbyist down in Washington for about 2 years or so. And my background also includes designing public policy programs for nonprofits and governments who are trying to have an impact. So it's very good to be here today.
Thanks for being here. Kristen.
I'm Kristin Honey, and like many innovators out there, I have a bit of an odd duck background, where I was trained as a biologist, co-founded a tech company in the 90s because I realized that scientists were not very good managers. And where do you get those skills to manage projects, manage people, and leadership? So I thought business was where I was at. And then the dot-com bubble burst. We were scrappy, innovative, entrepreneurial, and survived. I left there a few years later because I realized that I was much more motivated and satisfied, just personally fulfilled by feeling that I had a mission and a purpose that was making the world better rather than just quarterly financial statements. So I went back to science and did a lot of environmental work. So I've worked in government, nonprofit, and private sector. Then went and did a master's at UC Santa Cruz. So I was a banana slug, did a lot of environmental policy, and then I realized I wanted to do more rigorous quantitative work. And where to learn that? Get a PhD. So I went to Stanford for my PhD, and again, that was a weird interdisciplinary program where you had to pass your comps in 2 disciplines. So I'm a biologist by training, but did a lot of economics. And really, if you think of any natural resource issue, it has to be economically sustainable. So kind of that mix of biology and econ was where I worked for fisheries. And I'm from the working waterfronts in Maine originally, and so a lot of my work was trying to give voice to the local wisdom and the community kind of knowledge that is available, but not necessarily quantified and put into the stock assessment models that we use to manage fish populations and policy. So it's really giving voice to people through my PhD, who might otherwise have tons of wisdom but be marginalized. Did that through a lens of complex adaptive systems. You could apply it to fisheries, you could apply it to environment, you could apply it to a lot of things. Then I went to DC as a fellow with the American Association for the Advancement of Science. It's a program that takes scientists and engineers and puts you on Capitol Hill or into federal agencies in Washington, DC. I was put at Department of Energy, and then the healthcare.gov fiasco happened. And some of the fellows, innovation fellows at the Department of Energy, were literally pulled into the White House and told, fix this. And so when the Presidential Innovation Fellows were pulled to fix healthcare.gov, Department of Energy said, who's gonna run our open data and innovation portfolio? And the fellows who were leaving for the White House said, Kristin Honey can. So they threw me the open data and innovation portfolio, and I pivoted away from climate change and complex systems and water energy nexus science research to let's do open data. And pivoted back to the entrepreneur kind of tech skills that I hadn't touched in a good 20 years almost, maybe 15, and loved it. It was great. So I ran the open data portfolio, and then in 2015, President Obama's White House asked me if I would run his open data portfolio for all federal agencies. So I moved over to the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, did open data, a lot of hackathons, a lot of civic tech, and then we did a lot with data interoperability, so empowering patients with their own access to medical records, and worked with data-driven innovation. Then with the election, there was a big change in Washington, D.C., and I was one of the rare scientists who led a portfolio that truly had bipartisan support. So I was able to stay on in the White House and moved over to the White House Office of Management Budget and institutionalized a lot of the data work through the President's Management Agenda and the Federal Data Strategy. And then in the past 6 months or so, I really realized that 3 years in the White House is a long time. You can get burnt out, but also I miss science. I miss connecting the data for a purpose. Unlocking it was great, but why are we doing this? And there was an opportunity to go over to the Secretary's office in Health and Human Services and work with the Chief Technology Officer. So again, it's back to data-driven innovation for the opioids crisis, for mental health, and the thing I'm super passionate about these days is Lyme disease and tick-borne illness. So that's the space I'm in now, and what I am excited about being here today, it's really the discussion with all of us, but hearing about, like, looking at all these innovators out there, and the next generation of people. It's very inspiring and humbling.
So thanks, Kristen and Blake.
Hey everyone, it's great to be here. Thanks so much to the organizers for putting all of this together. I know it's not an easy thing to do. So I work with Matt at Second Muse. My work started there a little more than 4 years ago, working with a large media organization to help them build their media innovation group. From there, transitioned a lot into the civic tech, open data space, engaging citizen scientists, students and aspiring entrepreneurs around using open data to develop innovative solutions. And over the past few years, my work has focused on partnering with cities to build more inclusive startup ecosystems, more open startup ecosystems. And specifically right now, I'm working in partnership with NYCDC to run a hardware startup incubator called FutureWorks Incubator based in Brooklyn.
Awesome. Thank you, everyone. And one thing I just want to say before we even dive into more of the questions is that I feel like any one of you could be a speaker here at the Social Enterprise Conference and put on your own panel. And there's so much wisdom within the room, so we'll have a good chunk of time for questions. But I really just want to start actually with Kristen, asking you more about the importance of collaboration, because you mentioned you do have that perspective of the nonprofit world, public, private sector, even the association world. And I'm wondering for you, especially when it comes to your work with Lyme disease, why is it so important to collaborate, and who are you collaborating with? I know we talked a little bit before about patients, but what does that unlikely collaboration look like for you?
Excellent, great question. So there are a few kind of strategies or things that have led me through. So one is a difficult problem. I think of them as the wicked problems. It's a term we use in ecology. It actually came out of social sciences, and it actually is an academic term, wicked problem. Coming from Maine, sounds cool too, wicked. But these wicked problems are super complex. They demand interdisciplinary collaboration, and they're so complex that just by studying them, you're fundamentally changing the system, and the solution is moving, and they may never even be solved. They may be intractable, but you can move the needle on them. So those are the challenges to look at. And I firmly believe that if we, if medicine alone or if science alone could solve those problems, we would not have them. So you have to step back, expand the solution space, and then with a very open mind, listen to what people on the ground, or listen to those who are facing those challenges from different perspectives, what they say. There's often a translation involved. Often there are big stakes, and people have been hurt. Some of them maybe, especially with Lyme disease, have died because of lack of action or failed medical treatment. So there's anger there, and being able to hear that, sit with that, and not get defensive, not think your way is right, not think that the attacks are on your education, on your organization, about you personally, but see that as a barometer for the need, and then create the space. If you're an innovator, the role as a leader in the innovation space is to create a safe space for everyone to voice their opinion. So lived experience with Lyme disease, or lived experience with suicide, something like that, is equally valuable, in my opinion, to the PhD or the MD. And if you can create that space and harness the ideas from it and translate across different languages or different kind of cultural ways of expressing things, a lot of good can come out of that. It does not happen overnight. You have to build a lot of trust across really, really different groups who maybe for decades have not trusted each other or gotten along. And I think one way to do that is just to show up and be consistent over time. I definitely think of trust as consistency over time.
Yeah, definitely. And I think I hear a lot of see a lot of heads nodding on the panel. And I think one thing that's really important for us, and some of us were talking about this beforehand, is just really getting into what some of those challenges are, and to kind of frame it, at least from my perspective. One thing that I've realized in looking at everyone on this panel is that we have a lot of different experiences represented. So we have U.S. government with citizens and patients and so on and so forth. We have Blake, who's worked on a bunch of different projects, but largely with these larger organizations as stakeholders, working with startups and with citizens. Clarence working with similar, but from an international development perspective, and Eriko working to connect what's happening in Boston with Japan. And so I really want to hear from you, really beginning with Eriko, what are some of those challenges that you face driving that important collaboration forward?
for my challenge is everywhere. But anyway, so for example, I'm take the example for NASA Hackathon, let's say. So we actually want to foster people's entrepreneurial mindset. So that's we aim. So we put one thing, very hard thing is the, we actually bring the Japanese people online to join our NASA Hackathon Boston to get together. So one thing is, to find the people who enough brave enough to, willing to collaborate in Boston people in the online. Because they have a time difference, they have a culture difference, they have communication different style and language. So, but in order to attract Japanese people to join our NASA hackathon is, of course, very difficult for us to do. And also, after we get the people, so we have to coordinate that team. Or we have to, so most of the people, people wants to collaborate with Japanese people, come to the, team to collaborate. And then we have people from Japan to collaborate online. So team doesn't show up magically. So we have to really have curated team building session to, for example, we have one project for building some kind of iOS, some data-driven system. So we have to have some kind of back-end person, front-end person, data person, and then project manager. So we asked all skill sets to Japanese attendee and American attendee to plot all skill sets in a balanced way, so that we make sure everyone work comfortably and then we have balanced team. That probably way to successfully run this project. So go back to your question. The challenge is, so how to make the perfect team for international, the mixture of people culture is probably most difficult for us.
Mm-hmm. And I guess knowing that you've worked on the Space Apps Challenge and you mentioned the culture, the time, the communication being some barriers, I'm curious also from your perspective, Blake, like how that resonates with you and what other challenges you see with the work you do with Second Muse.
So I think our work always starts with our stakeholders and making sure that we're actually helping them solve their challenges. It's Space Apps is an example of a project that we work on. That's actually how Eriko and I know each other. And we're lucky to have this kind of grand overarching idea of being able to work on challenges that are related to space and NASA, and there's this big inspirational hook. But there's also very tangible ways for participants to get involved and build a team, and actually be able to fulfill a nice call to action there. How that's looked specifically in the startup world, to get back to your question, we started our work in New York back in 2014, and I'm not sure how familiar everybody is with hardware startups or the ecosystem there in New York, but this seems like ages ago compared to how developed and collaborative it is at this point. But we met founders who were working out of shipping containers, and just kind of like off on their own, working on a product which is extremely hard and isolating. And one of the big things that we saw and realized that we needed to do was look for ways to just simply bring hardware startup founders together. And our first year on that program really centered a lot around that. And we of course did the all of the startup accelerator, incubator type things. We had mentors, we had events, we put our teams in front of investors. But the thing that they came back to was that they just loved the lunches that we would host for them, because it was an opportunity for them to kind of get together And it was almost like a group therapy session where they were able to share out some of the challenges they were facing. So yeah, I think that's a big thing to remember, is just that it all starts with trying to address those very ground level problems and looking for simple and sometimes intuitive ways to do that.
Yeah. I think one thing that I love about that is that it's tactical, so it's something that probably a lot of people could take away, like put on a lunch to better engage with your community, and I'm sure we'll get into more of that. But like going from New York to Australia and international development in this the broader world, you know, Clarence, I'm wondering, what do those challenges look like for you, and how have you start to navigate the challenges you face with collaboration?
One of the challenges in working for Australia was, from New York to Australia is about 23, I think it's the longest flight in the world, second longest or so. So it's, from the Australian perspective, that's a challenge is distance. But from the challenge for the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and the Australian aid program, and I think for a lot of donors, was in, all right, so you talk about wicked problems. Reaching the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals is probably the wickedest, if that's a word.
It is now.
I made up a word in Harvard. One of the wickedest challenges that the world faces. And for donor agencies like the former USAID or for USAID, I've worked both for the US government and for the Australian government, looking at trying to solve the challenge of how do you improve people's lives globally and hit the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, aid agencies around the world, I think, look and say, we can't do this alone, particularly in an era where you have declining foreign assistance budgets, and frankly in a global political environment where economic nationalism doesn't really correspond well with helping other people through foreign assistance. But even before that, you know, governments have realized these problems, governments don't have the resources, for a variety of reasons, don't have resources. So for Australia, budget cuts led to how do we work more effectively with innovators, with the private sector, and really identify solutions. Among the challenges, if you wanted to talk about some of the challenges around it, is for, at least for the aid program in Australia, and I think for a lot of people in the international development community, collaboration has been tough, because from a government mindset, collaborating with other governments is what you do. Collaborating with the private sector, collaborating with entrepreneurs, it's not really the most used activity, or it's not in the government mindset up until recently. So for us, one of the key challenges was breaking down that mindset that basically said we have the resources and solutions. So in the international development community these days, we have fewer resources and we certainly don't have all the solutions. But it's breaking out of that mindset for us was the biggest challenge. Like, how do you start looking at other people, and we throw around terms like co-creating, and that's great, but that requires a shift in mindset. And so for us, that, for at least for my former colleagues, that's sort of an ongoing challenge.
Yeah. And I definitely want to go back to Kristen to ask more about that, about how you work to get people on board with that mindset of valuing innovation, open data, and collaboration, because we know that within any large organization, governments, corporations, the list goes on and on, universities, I'm sure like Harvard, there's a lot of bureaucracy. So how do you get people on board with what you're doing? Because it might sound intuitive, yes, we need to collaborate, but obviously it's not that simple when a lot of organizations do struggle to embrace that more collaborative mindset. So how are you doing that from your work?
I think one important thing, starting point, is authenticity. So work on problems that you're passionate about, because you can't fake that. So for example, today is Open Data Day, and I'm super excited about that. There are 300 different events in the US alone with civic tech people like hacking on data and solving their own community problems. And I did not go to Washington, DC to work on open data. Those doors opened because I was passionate about it, did it on the side, and that purpose came through. So I think being passionate in that authenticity is really a foundational thing. And then the strategy I've used is to get clear on the purpose. What's your North Star goal? So I really put a lot of time into a vision, the future ideal state, your mission, where you want to be today as an organization or as a team and as a group within the bounds of reality. And then probably most importantly for how I do my work are the values. How does your team operate and what are those core values? Some of the examples that I've done for some different groups is find the truth, tell the truth. And if you have a value like that, it creates a space that you can, more than without it, speak truth to power and say there are difficult problems here and I'm following our values. So if you figure out who you are and how you want to run your teams, identifying and articulating those values, it also helps people to recognize early on if they're right for your team. You don't want to recruit people that are misaligned on values. So if you're explicit about that, then it sort of self-selects the right folks. And then in terms of leading a community, I love that word co-creation. So important that people have a voice, a meaningful voice, and you iterate and you improve it together. That does not always work. And I want to plus one the lessons learned that were just said, because the way government often works is silos and hierarchy and everything. So co-creation flies in the face of that. And sometimes you have to recognize where your environment is not suited for it, and then just pull the ripcord and get out. Because you can be the best innovator in the world and have the best values and have the best mission, but if you're not in an environment that allows you to have flexibility and color outside the lines or do things differently and co-create, it won't happen. And a good example from that in my own career is I was 3 years at the White House, the first year and a half in the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, which is a policy council. So you give guidance and all that, but you don't have money, you don't have like a huge budget, you operate through influence. And building, co-creating solutions with the communities, I was great at my job, I loved it, it felt like life-giving. I mean, it was one of the best year and a half of my career, I would say. Then I moved the exact same portfolio, I don't think I changed as a person, and have the same network. If anything, my network grew and got bigger. Moved over to the White House Office of Management Budget, which is the biggest office in the White House that basically gives all the money out for the entire executive branch of government, federal government. And the culture is much more risk averse because they can't make mistakes. If you make mistakes, you're not just on the front page of the Washington Post, you're wasting taxpayers' dollars. So if this White House OMB office said something, all the agencies would pay super serious attention and change their behavior based on that. So there was not only no risk tolerance or low risk tolerance, it would have been irresponsible for me to color outside the lines and do these things. So recognizing when the environment's right and when maybe this co-creation space is more challenging, and then, and learn from it and find a space that is more aligned with what you want to do.
Wow. Yeah. I'll just pipe in and just say that tolerance for risk is a really big factor, because as a colleague once said to me, he said, it's all fine and good if the private sector wants to place a big bet on something and for us to join in on that big bet. But people have to remember, he said, we're playing with taxpayer dollars here. And so that really, you hit a wall to a certain extent with government organizations. And it's a wall that, it's not that people don't want to innovate, but they're chained to the fact that these are taxpayer dollars. And the moment you have a front page story about losing X number of thousands of dollars, I mean, I'm sorry, the Department of Defense can do this, but an aid program can't do it, So the moment you have that negative story, then nobody wants to innovate. No one wants to innovate themselves out of a career.
It's hard to innovate if you can't fail,
Exactly.
because you will fail.
Yep.
And you learn a lot from those failures.
Are any reactions to that from a little bit of a different perspective, Blake, Eriko?
So I mean, for example, working with a company mainly Japanese company, they want to do open innovation. But, again, so some company really want to, don't want to take a risk. So, I mean, not only risk, but they don't wanna open their data to, although they wanna do some kind of innovation, but it's kind of, oh, I need an NDA, or this kind of stuff, right? So, but we wanna try to help them, but the company don't really wanna take any risk, so we cannot, help them though. This kind of thing is still mindset, I guess, so people's mindset, that's why we're trying to build entrepreneurial mindset for people that's being everywhere. So collaborate done by people, one person. I mean, if I find very open-minded person in a organization, I can work very well. Very well. But then I cannot find any open-minded person in an organization, it's very hard to work with. Yeah.
I would just add that, like as somebody who works mostly on the operator side, that it's really important if you're a governmental agency trying to run some kind of innovation program like this to set some parameters around what you're trying to do. I think a lot of times well-intended initiatives that start with pretty specific objectives go off the rails quickly. We want to do, we started by wanting to run this event to promote open data, et cetera, and now there are all these other side objectives which can kind of distract from the initial thing and oftentimes lower the quality of that thing that you set out to do because you're spread too thin. And so I think it can be really helpful to just make sure that there are clear goals and objectives for what you're trying to do whenever you're setting up an innovation program like this. And then there can always be space for unexpected results, but at least you have that framework in place to make sure you're getting what you actually intended. So.
One strategy for trying to do innovation, if you're in a organization or office that has a low risk tolerance, that I found can be helpful, and this is true for funding as well. If you if you look at some of the investments that are out there, a lot of times the most brilliant minds are pitching things that the grant reviewers can't even understand. So what do you do for those like leaders that are so far ahead that it's going to take 10 years for other scientists to get it? And so talking to people at like DARPA and Innovation Labs, Department of Energy, and BARDA's Health and Human Services, one of the strategies they do is to bracket how they think about their portfolios. And even if it's only 5, 10, or 20% that are high risk, potentially high reward, you can then manage expectations of like, oh, we're only using 2% of the dollars in this high risk, high reward. So you set it up that you might never get anything back. And then the rest of your portfolio is safe and within the normal bounds, but you might get some great successes. So that stratified ranking within, with how you're going to pick projects or what you're going to do. As an individual in an organization, you can do the same thing with your performance and your job description. It's like, can you have 5-10% for professional development time? And then take a few hours a week to do things that are outside the normal bounds.
It's like agile, right? Versus waterfall versus agile.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
I agree.
Awesome. And we've been going for a little bit and just thinking of time because we're, I think, just past the halfway point or about at the halfway point. I definitely want to open it up to a few questions from this group if anyone just wants to put up their hand. I saw this hand right over here first.
So this question is addressed to Kristen. So first of all, my name is Michael Rand, and I had the good fortune to participate in the opioid challenge at Columbia University, and we won.
Nice, congrats.
But if you don't know about it, you might want to look it up on the web, see who the experts and various people there, and so forth and so on. And since you mentioned you were involved with this space, one of the questions I had is, okay, so we worked on various technical solutions, like we were creating an app to connect people out of the hospital to community agencies, so they weren't just out of their own. And then there was a woman who organized a protest at the Guggenheim Museum against Sackler, where she had people rain prescription stuff that went viral all over the world, etc. So that was a different way of attacking this. And I was curious, based on your experience and expertise, and what your thinking was.
My first thought is we need all the approaches. I am a systems thinker. In ecology, everything's connected, and complex adaptive systems, a similar approach. And I think we all have a different role within these systems to change an ecosystem. I personally am probably a neutral knowledge broker. I'm good at translating information across really diverse groups, whether it's different administrations, whether it's translating the wisdom of a working waterfront in Maine to the DC policymakers and fisheries. Same thing with the healthcare space, that lived patient experience. How do you translate that so we can actually change national law and policy? So that's my role. But I could not do that role if there weren't people out there screaming, protesting, and hair on fire to create the space and the policymakers to say there's a need here. And I couldn't focus or put challenges out there that need addressing if there weren't practitioners and patients on the front lines who were figuring out what the problems are. What are those concrete things that are blocking access to care? So I firmly believe there's a role for everyone, and it's going to be different for each of us. And in an ecosystem approach, you need to hit it from all sides. Who knows what's going to tip the scales, but eventually, something has to change.
Yeah.
So I applaud you for getting in the trenches and being a part of the solution.
Yeah. And I love what you were saying about that, because I think something that we talk about a lot within Second Muse is that these complex problems, there's no silver bullet solution. And I think oftentimes within the social enterprise space, we see that person or that organization that thinks they might have that silver bullet solution, when oftentimes it's a lot of different puzzle pieces needed to serve as a solution that actually makes an impact on those complex problems. Are there, I see a question right over there.
Hi, a question for any of you. How do you navigate collaborations and partnerships when there's a large power disparity between the two groups that are trying to navigate, especially from the point of view of the one with the less power?
Yeah, and I love that question, because it goes back to this dynamic of governments working with citizens and startups, or I think that's really the big one that stands out to me. But there are all sorts of other dynamics. So just wondering if that, if anyone has any initial response to that great question.
Well, just from a governmental perspective, and the development community perspective, it's an interesting. Your question is sort of happening in real time now, because governments have had the power and the money in the development space. Western governments over decades, and that's shifted a lot just in the past 5 to 10 years. So there's less money, and there are other powers that are rising in the development space. And then you have philanthropists and social entrepreneurs. So right now, the answer to your question from my perspective is we're all in the process of figuring that out. Because government still feels like it has the say, but governments don't necessarily have the money to enforce that say. And so that whole power dynamic right now is almost in real time shifting. So it's a to be seen sort of dynamic from my perspective.
And I think, as an agency that works with governments, I would say we tend not to work with people who we aren't aligned with philosophically. We believe a lot in the little guy. We believe that the individual participant is just as important as the governmental stakeholder. And so we work with clients early on to really try to set some of those fundamental and underlying philosophies that we point to through the life of the program, and really try to hold them accountable to what those values are, because that at the end of the day, that's the only way these types of initiatives are going to yield results, is if you have people who are engaged and feel like their interests are being looked out for.
Blake, could you talk more about what some of those values are? I would think of inclusivity as one of them, but are there others that stand out to you?
I can speak to this a little bit. So one of the things we always prioritize is collaboration over competition, and one of the most surefire ways to blow that is by having some big gaudy prize. So if you want some cool and collaborative project to emerge from an initiative, you can't just throw a bunch of money at it and expect people to work together, because that's that's kind of disincentivizing people to collaborate because they're competing for this big pot of money. And what we've seen on our programs over the years is that if you kind of set a modest prize amount, it's enough to inspire people to be engaged throughout the weekend, but it's not the only thing that that people are focused on. Another principle that I'll speak to too is that like there's expertise from lots of different places, and it's important to emphasize that throughout the life of a program, whether it's a day-long hackathon or an ongoing innovation challenge. So we try to position people as different people as experts through the life of our programs, not just like the person who quote unquote has the most power. And so I think that tends to help too, because we really like to give different people platforms and make sure that their voices are heard and that their expertise is also given equal weight to others. So.
And Second Muse that helps run the NASA Space Apps Challenge does a fabulous job at that. So if you're ever looking to make an inclusive ecosystem, check out this NASA Space Apps, because kids, people who have never thought of data and tech before, women, like just that inclusivity, the language, their approach is what I always point to as a bright spot. In terms of the David and Goliath kind of strategies, two things for that. One is in government, it's not homogeneous. So you have the Goliaths and huge, they could sink initiatives and kill things really quick. And a strategy of use with pretty good success is to do the work. Sometimes you have to do the work under the radar and demonstrate that the sky isn't going to fall if you were to include citizens or if you were going to do things a different way. And then with that success, as you get traction, give the credit away. Make the biggest critics, the people who are going to squash you, make them look good. They were there from day one. Maybe it was their idea. So that's one thing, is do the work, demonstrate the minimum viable product or some success, and then be very generous with the credit. And if you can do that in a way that brings some of your former critics in, it can get a new life of its own. That's not always possible. And the way I have navigated that, particularly when it comes to giving fishermen a voice or patients a voice, or the little the civic tech people on the ground who maybe know veterans homelessness better than anyone but don't have budgets and stuff. The way of navigating that is through data. And if you can take all those anecdotes and get data and use the power of the crowd, whether it's citizen science, crowdsourcing, that becomes compelling, and then that can translate to numbers that if you extrapolate out can catch the attention of policymakers and of the Goliaths to maybe think differently.
Data can also really help you understand who's in the room and who's not in the room, and that's just something that came to mind when I was hearing Blake, and then even through your response, Kristen, because I think we look at the Harvard Social Enterprise Conference, for instance. There's a very specific profile for the type of people who could come here, who could afford to get here from out of town, or so on and so forth. And so I think one thing that's so important is to think who isn't in the room, who's impacted by this issue, and how do we actually give them a voice in the conversation. Is there another question? I did see your hand up a little bit earlier.
Hi, I wanted to know if any of you could provide any examples of co-creations, collaborations that have been successful, whether it's a campaign or a one-off or something like that. And the reason why I'm asking is because I work in an advertising agency. We have some of the largest clients in the world, and I'm leading our CSR initiative. And we're in a position where we can pull in our clients to help with some of the SDGs and solving them. And I have one example that I know of, but I was just curious if any of you could share any others.
Yeah, examples of successful co-creations for anyone who didn't hear that. So maybe we could go over here if either of you have examples of successful co-creation efforts with other organizations.
And even if not, if you have any thoughts on what would be a good collaboration, or how brands could get more involved or something.
Australia did an interesting through our we have a an organization within the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade called the Innovation Exchange, which was set up to help the aid program to work more effectively with entrepreneurs and philanthropists. And that's how I actually got associated with, we met Matt through a project that we did called the Blue Aquaculture Challenge to promote sustainable aquaculture in the Pacific Islands. And that whole initiative really was, I think, one of our first examples in the aid program of really just, instead of coming at a problem and saying, here's what we want to do, will you join us? We sat down with Second Muse. We had other partners in there, like NASA was a part of that as well, to really talk about, it was a great example of just everyone coming to the table, recognizing the problem, identifying the problem. This isn't normally how development projects go, so it was kind of new. And everyone bringing their ideas and solutions to the table, with no one saying, like, I don't think that the Innovation Exchange said this, no one saying, this is what we want to do, here's how we want you to do it, but really being open to what kind of ideas do you have? What kind of ideas does NASA have? What kind of ideas does Australia have? So, and I think, I'm kind of proud to say that was a real successful collaboration, a good example of a collaboration, and the results of that were pretty positive.
So my organization is, doing hackathon or business plan competition. But for example, we, collaborate with one food business in Japanese food business here in Cambridge, in order to create their go-to-market strategy. So we provide, we had a, event to have, gathering idea from, collaboration with Japanese and American people get together. Because in order to tackle their issue is trying to bring their food culture, Japanese food culture in Cambridge, Boston. But they have to know what their food culture in here, but, and also Boston people need to know what's the Japanese food like, So we have a synergy together to bring their both culture, and then these two culture people work together to bring out the idea. So our organization and the food business got together and collaborate and bring their open to marketing strategy. We sometimes do this kind of collaboration. It's very successful.
And I would just add that while altruism is very important, and you want whatever this partnership looks like to be something that's authentic and genuine, and you want people to actually be invested, you're well served to think a lot about the value proposition for who's going to be involved and how they're going to interact together. Maybe think about those things first, or give them equal weight to what the big hook is. So really important to consider both aspects whenever you're designing something like this.
Yeah, and examples, bright spots for co-creation that I've seen. I think first it depends on your definition of success. Because one of my favorite examples just announced their closing because they couldn't secure funding. But there's a great, platform called Madison.io. Just type in Madison, open policy, and it will come up. And it was a really interesting way to put policies or ideas online and then have citizens edit it and change it. And actually being on the government side and, we're the ones issuing the policy, it was super helpful for us because it was all organized and you didn't have to do any translation with all these people submitting comments and the not readable formats and stuff. It was done for you, but most importantly, it was public. Everything people wrote on there was for the world to see. So the power of the crowd would actually improve the policy and ideas would build on ideas. So Madison.io, many cities have written their open data policy on that. Some federal policies have been generated that way. Another great example with co-creation solutions is the Open Government Partnership, which is an international kind of consortium, a voluntary thing with 40 or 50 countries around the world who are trying to make more transparent, accountable, and responsive government for the citizens. So responding to a government means that, you know, they listen to the citizens, they get feedback. So if you've ever signed a petition on change.org or anything like that, those sort of mechanisms are part of the Open Government Partnership. And I believe they have tons of best practices and ideas on their website. And then the last suggestion I'll give is the human connection. There's no substitution for getting people in the same room, especially when there's really polarized or different groups, because it's much harder to demonize or throw rocks or hate someone because government is bad and we've done all these horrible things, when you know that it's not just government, but that's Kristin Honey, who is working hard on a problem. And you still may not agree, but getting people together in a room kind of dispels that us versus them. And you see that over and over and over again, like in forestry management, cooperative management there worked really well by getting people together. Fisheries later replicated that, and I'm seeing that now in the Lyme disease community that is arguably very contentious. And if nothing else, even if the parties don't agree, it generates a new appreciation for how much the other side is working on it, or how much the other side is suffering and they need this problem to be addressed. So that in-person connection is very important.
Absolutely, and I love that we've kind of sprinkled in some of the tactical approaches with lunches and other ways of connecting in person. I think we have time for one more question. I saw your hand up over here.
So the Sustainable Development Goals have 169 targets, where lately employee engagement and well-being research has showed the benefits of, you know, that continuous change cycle as they increase. Now, I guess my question is, when is that can be put into play? You know, government, like government employees' well-being, I mean, was way down last month. I mean, but if they focused on that, I mean, the sky's the limit on solving problems. What's standing in the way of getting that to become more of a policy focus, subjectively?
With the health and well-being of people within.
Any city, I mean, healthier citizens, you know, better government, healthier employees, more productivity. So I don't understand, you know, I guess my question is just,
Yeah,
in the future, is that going to be more
Hopefully it won't be too far in the future, because you can't affect any sort of change at all if you don't have people who are feeling healthy and valued themselves in an organization. So whether it's government or private sector, we just have to take better care of ourselves personally, and as we have to have more of a sense of community. And if you have those sort of things, if you treat your government employees or your employees in your company or yourself with respect, then it'll help us get to those goals. So.
Maybe one more question.
Okay, so this could be a good closing question. So there's a lot of things we can change, we can learn, we can do better, right? But in your own space, if there's only one thing you choose to add or change will make the biggest impact, what will that be and why?
Yeah, and actually, just to add to that question, one of my closing question is really sort of to that point about the impact that you all want to have, because I think what makes the four of you unique in the broader scheme of things is that you're all collaborative, you're all looking to, you know, make a difference. And I think I was actually just going to ask a question I love to ask people, which is, if your life were a book or documentary, what would the title be and why? And maybe that title is the one thing you want to impact. And so now I'll just leave you with that, and maybe somehow you could eke out an answer between these questions.
Pick
It's a
up
tough
something
question.
like really, really important to you, like one thing otherwise.
Yeah. All right, I'll go for it. So if I had a book or documentary, I was going to change one thing. I think I'd have to call it The Silver Linings of Lyme. Because, yeah, the silver linings of Lyme. Because Lyme is very contentious. Two different medical schools of thought while they're debating. insurance companies are denying care because like standard of care outside at least one of the two guidelines, and patients are falling between the cracks. I was misdiagnosed for over a decade, almost died, needed a wheelchair at times, Parkinson's like shakes, couldn't read. When I looked at letters, it would look like wingdings, hieroglyphics. Was told by several doctors that I would probably never work again. And I vowed then that if I ever found my way out, I would try to pay it forward. And never in imagined years would have, like, you know, could I imagine I'd get my Stanford PhD, end up in the White House in a position to connect science and policy and empower many patients who don't have a voice. But to get myself out, because no doctors would treat me, they literally said they do not treat late stage or chronic Lyme. I ended up having to watch YouTube videos and IV myself for treatments. It was crazy. Yep. And a combination of nano silver, nano gold, and a bunch of trace minerals, kind of old treatment called oligotherapy is what they used to call it. I swear that saved my life in combination with antibiotics. So the silver linings of Lyme would probably be the title of my book. And if I could do one thing, it would be to contain and cure Lyme and tick-borne disease.
Wow.
So your question was if you could change one thing?
Change or add one thing.
I would change mindsets, because I feel like we're in an era where there's a mindset that you feel it creeping in. Well, maybe it's not just creeping in, but I think there's a feeling of these challenges, we can't solve them, whether it's climate, whether it's hunger, whether it's, go down the list. I feel like we're in an era where people are feeling like these challenges are too big. And I would change mindsets, because I think that there is a lot of potential and possibility, but we've got to break out, and we, meaning us as a species, have to break out of this sort of mental cul-de-sac that we're in. We can't seem to get out of, and remember that we have a lot of capability and potential, and if you drop the labels, whether it's government, private sector, whatever, it's about finding solutions to big challenges, and from whatever perspective you're coming from, or whatever sector, it's still doable. Otherwise, I wouldn't get up in the morning and get excited about the things that I'm doing or will be doing. So my book would be called Mindset, but I think that the book has already been written. And that title has already been written.
Yeah, I have to say same, because I would say, same thing, but I would say entrepreneurship. Yeah, because one thing I learned in my Babson College, in my MBA, is meaning of entrepreneurship. Actually, before I go to MBA, I thought entrepreneurship is being CEO. But then entrepreneurship is the mindset to think and then act, and then they have ownership for your decision you make. So that everything is come to mindset. So everything in entrepreneur and corporate person and a big company and government, human being, right? So everybody has to have this kind of entrepreneurship mindset so that world can change. So.
Yeah, and I'd maybe piggyback on that, and I don't know if I have that title, sorry, Matt. But in it, maybe coupled with this mindset is also to make startup ecosystems a bit more accessible. I think like it's great when governments are gung-ho about getting startups in their cities and they go straight to the university pipeline. But there's a lot of talent that exists elsewhere in a city and in a community that has something to contribute to this world. And I feel like the next phase of this is gonna be figuring out ways to kind of pair these people who have something to offer, who are very interested, but maybe don't have some of the like informal training that and informal connections that are required to actually get involved in that space. So that's something that I'm really excited about over the next I don't know, indefinite period. And I think government definitely has a role to play in kind of creating more of those conditions. So.
And I just want to say as we wrap up, well, thank you, and we'll work on a title for you. But I think as we wrap up, like one thing I love about this panel is that there's so many different perspectives, and you all had a lot to share. And I'm sure we could sit here for ages, and each of you could probably ask questions to everyone for days and days and days on end. So just want to thank you for sharing what you did during this panel, and also just want to say from my perspective that I think it's so important that people are sharing their stories uniquely, whether that's like professional and more personal or the intersection of both. And so just want to thank you all for doing that now, and hopefully we can give them all a round of applause for that. And thanks everyone for joining. I'm sure we'll be here for a few minutes after, but thanks again. Yeah.